Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. Today I'm taking a break from my time-inspired art that I have been doing as of late, to instead focus again on characters and their design, as I have been missing it somewhat. So today I have been drawing 3 characters, where they are each inspired by something within nature, as that has been my starting point today. From there I had to pick 3 things that I felt I could work with, or I could look at and see where it would eventually end up. So without further delay, let's turn our attention to the first character then, shall we? Now the first up for today in our characters here is an item that almost took this video in a slightly different direction very early on. For a while now I've played with the idea of making characters based off various mushrooms, since there are quite a few that look rather unique or interesting that draw my eye. There are multiple routes that they could go in based on where they grow, what they look like, and also their properties as a mushroom species, so I felt that I could make a few unique characters for it. So when I first decided to look at nature and mushrooms in general, I did consider picking 2 other mushrooms, so that this week would have become mushrooms as people instead. Yet I have chosen to pocket that idea for now and only include this one, and maybe save the other ideas for another time. Today I instead chose to look at the inky cap mushroom in particular, since it's been a mushroom I find quite appealing to look at, and quite interesting too. They have this really unique dripping appearance that meant I could draw off of this in the design, and it was really a unique and strong choice for my starting point here. I did consider for a while about maybe picking another one too. I did consider for a short while that if I was doing mushrooms, I might have been better going with one that people would recognise a little bit more. And that one's typically a red mushroom with the white dots, as that is the kind of go-to idea of a mushroom when people think about it. So it was a stronger contender if I wanted something a little bit more known than the inky cap. Though then my logic was that if I was going off common mushrooms that I see on a daily basis, I could have looked at a cooking mushroom, or ones that keep popping up in the front garden. Yet I still favoured the inky cap, so I went with it, since I find it fun. I went with it since I had a range of early ideas for this one as well. See, quite a few years ago, and I do mean quite a few years ago when I was still far newer to art and characters, I first saw this mushroom and felt that it was something I could possibly design a character based off. Now, that design is old. It's far from the best, and looking back, it wasn't that good either. But when I'd made it, I was proud, and I quite enjoyed the process of it. It inspired me to make more characters from various things around that I liked, things like the rosy maple moth as well. And those are part of the journey to where I am now, and I did enjoy it. If I can find that image, I will likely insert a picture of it here for reference, but that does depend massively on if I can find that sketchbook or not, since I can't remember quite off the top of my head where I placed it. Yet with that said, I had new ideas for it too. I did look at the mushroom more than old art, so that was mainly since I could generate new ideas that made me excited for it now, just to include and work around, as I didn't want this to turn into redrawing that old design. So let's just talk about the mushroom itself for a bit here, shall we? It's quite interesting, and it is needed for general ideas and what I was working off. See, the term inky cap actually refers to a group of mushrooms rather than a single species. The main tie between them all is that, on spore maturity, they begin to liquefy and can cause this drippy appearance that first drew my eye towards this group. Now, I could go into the science and the process here and technical terms and everything, but I would very likely run out of time to explain everything and also the drawing, so it will remain as this very simple explanation for now. Yet the term inky cap has many mushrooms under it that differ in appearance and so on. For this one, I referred to a specific type of inky cap though. The one I looked at is the Coprinus comatus, and I'm very likely mispronouncing that. It's otherwise referred to as the shaggy inky cap, or the lawyer's wig inky cap mushroom. I chose this one since it is the one that drew me in the first place. And it was also the one that I was most interested in out of any other that I looked at, since it has this taller cap when younger, before it begins to liquefy, when it meets maturity. The older ones look shorter, as the bottom has sort of eaten itself in the process of releasing the spores of the plant. This is where so many of the ideas came from too. Looking into it only solidified that I would end up working with it in some capacity here, since it just kept drawing me in and in. I mean, the process of it changing inspired me with the dripping appearance, as it was something I could apply in many areas and many ways. It was a challenge to work out which one I truly wanted to pursue, since there were so many options with the appearance. I mean, I also had the lifting section of the mushroom which inspired me early for textures and further ideas I wanted to pursue, that it all kind of meant that I did choose this one in particular. I mean, even with the shape of it and the two main variants made it all more appealing with the initial ideas, since I did have that little bit more to work with. Besides, it also had a very simplistic palette for me to use, which again added to the fun and the challenge. The mushroom itself is black, white with a little bit of grey, and that was kind of fun for me to use, especially in this video and this week, since I knew that the other two items I would choose would focus a bit more on bright colours and greens before all else. This one was a break. It didn't have any of that, there is no green in the mushroom at all, and it is very much a monotone plant. Maybe parts of the mushroom will appear brown at parts of its growth, and it's only in small amounts with that as well. So I knew palette-wise I could mess and experiment. I didn't want to introduce anything too drastic or different, but I knew that I could push the tones and the colours that little bit to see how it would end up. For example, the skin tone is the primary example of this. It ends up a very greyish purple to match the monochrome around it, whilst still blending in with the rest of the plant's palette, but standing out that little bit. Yes, the purple isn't in the actual plant, but it didn't matter to me too much, as it wasn't a strong colour or too different and too out there, and I did enjoy that little bit of freedom in making that choice. I went into it knowing that I would likely add tones to the palette or subtly shift the greys towards other colours that looked greyed out, as it would make the figure stronger and work that little bit better in my favour. My one rule had simply been that I didn't divert entirely from the mushroom's colour, or could I overpower it with any additional colours in comparison, since that would have defeated my initial purpose. So let's talk about the details themselves before we move on. I mean, those are the parts that matter here, and the interesting parts of the character are out of everything. The first detail to mention is the hat. You've likely seen them online yourself somewhere, those big hats that people make and decorate like mushroom. Usually they are the red and white mushroom variant, but I have seen a few people who change it up and make them off something else instead, and accent them with a few more decorations. That is kind of what inspired this hat, and what this detail became based on. Well, it was the primary reason I came to include it and thought of it. Personally, I love how they look. They're big and they're fun before all else, and it felt perfect for this character. It kind of further pushes the idea that they are based off of the mushroom that they're wearing, and the idea just worked so much better with the mature shape of the mushroom. The later stages do reflect the common idea of a mushroom shape a little bit better, the way that it curves up into a bump before going out to the sides. It was then perfect for the hat, with the dripping that looked like accents being hung from the rim for further details, that all kind of came together in a way in the end. From there, artistic license also came into play. I could add a few more strings of circles to push the accented appearance idea, and to make it seem like things were purposely being hung from the hat's rim, since I knew the figure themselves would end up kind of dressed up, in a sense, or decorated. From the drips, I got the idea of beads, and from the beads, I could add teardrops, as they linked into the droplets from the hat that would be the ink, and I knew that I would be adding them in multiple places going forwards as well. With it all in the end, this did end up as one of my favourite details for her. Okay, if I did another mushrooms, I couldn't give them all this detail, and I would have to get creative with the way I would be including the shapes into them. Yet for now I can enjoy it since it does add interest to that section of her, and it kind of becomes her main detail overall as well. However, speaking of shapes, I did want to include the younger stages of the mushroom at the same time. This is where the cap is taller before all else and more white in colour. There are some with others that discolours, maybe brown right at the top from the stem or the beginnings of the black at the base from where it would start to shift. But the younger stage is primarily white. Yet when it came to the early ideas, I felt that the younger shape translated to a dress before anything else. There was the round bit at the top that worked well for the top part of the dress, and the longer part of the mushroom cap worked well for a skirt that would remain narrow rather than poofing out like I would normally gravitate towards. It all kind of cemented the idea early on as well. This character would end up wearing a longer skirt with the top portion then carrying the rounder shape that would basically make it read as if she was wearing the entire mushroom itself. I then decided that I could add in some little details here and there, things like the texture from the actual cap of the mushroom, and it would work. This is how she ended up with the strapless dress that I could accent and work around. I could add more beads, a necklace and bracelets. I could make her arms somewhat drip as a nod to the fact that the mushroom itself is what melts, almost as if it was a fun and subtle nod that this character is that mushroom, and not simply dressed up as one. The style then let me add things for fun too, like the threads around her hand and the small dots tying back to the beads and so on. And I do wish I had a little bit more time to talk about them here, but we are going to have to move a little bit quickly so that this video doesn't end up like over an hour long. So those are more things that I have to briefly skip over for a moment. But all in all, I did really enjoy working with the mushroom and the small details, though I didn't really touch on them much. And though I didn't touch on them, they made the character what it is. The circle was a part that worked well with the drips, and the threads were then a detail that could be connected to quite a few areas. Maybe how the mushrooms often grow in groups in a system, or simply the longer part of a drip. They were fun before all else, and as I've already said here, I do enjoy how she turned out this time, and they do reflect the mushroom better than my first attempt many years ago. I mean, this time as well, I could actually add a bit of texture for the lifted sections and include them in the appearance and the outcome that would be on the mushroom. I could look at how it ties to her and what parts of the mushroom would affect how I created it. And also this time I could include both stages of the mushroom cycle, that I just couldn't before. It was kind of good in a way to start the set in this video with this one, as she definitely helped me kind of get the creativity flowing a little bit too for the others going forward, and kind of inspired me to keep going down this avenue, rather than maybe changing the idea for this video early on. However, speaking of the others, this is the end of the Inky Cap. So shall we see who ended up next with this group? The next one up in this video is Moss. Now, Moss is something that's just fun. It's fun to look at and interesting for reasons that I could never quite explain properly if someone asked me about it before. There's just something about the way it can blanket environments and the way it grows, how it can cover rocks and trees or grow just about anywhere. That isn't even touching on how moss can grow in caves alongside normal environments people think of like forests and so on. So it really wasn't a surprise to myself that I would include it here, as I was honestly more surprised that I've never done anything with it before. So with mushrooms, I narrowed down what I had been looking at quite a bit. Yet for moss, despite there being many species of moss, I wanted to keep it all rather broad and look at the typical appearance of moss that I picture more than anything. A lot of them will vary in shape and environment, so I probably could have looked at individual groups of species or single species if they were really unique. I mean, they then have their own properties, some of which I couldn't convey in this character, but would look at if I was looking at an individual moss species or looking at moss in various environments. Yet at the end of the day, I kind of decided that that wasn't what I was going to do for now. I'd already narrowed down with the mushrooms and I wanted something a bit broader here. I kind of wanted to create something that was more based on my general idea of moss, rather than limiting it to anything specific like I have before. And now, when I think of moss, I think of it in gardens, or growing in the forest, or on trees. Mainly, I think of it as moss within blanketing groups. And this route is what kind of began giving me plenty of ideas very early on in the development process. I mean, also for me, moss is very commonly small lines in terms of texture, which is another thing I could consider when working with this character and these ideas early on. Besides all of this, moss is then something I would think of to be soft, if not damp. So these were kind of the sort of prompts that I began forming the ideas on, as I've already briefly mentioned. The very first idea that came from this was a cloak or jacket of some kind. I did mess with both ideas, but given the other two characters and the directions that they were taking, I wanted to look at the cloak idea since it also fit that little bit better for what I picture when it comes to moss. From there, it was supposed to be a big cloak that looked as if it was made of moss, and this kind of also came from the mushroom hat that I drew previously. The hat from before definitely inspired having the other two incorporate the actual item into the clothes, as if they were wearing it, which for moss ended up better in the cloak. As I sketched the cloak, I then decided that I would include little things almost sticking out of it. There were leaves and rocks, as these can be found around moss quite commonly as well. They added detail to the cloak and, in a way, furthered the idea of moss's texture, alongside the way that I chose to line it with the broken spaces in the smaller lines. By this, I meant that the lines around the moss cloak aren't continuous. There's little strokes where the lines are the line art, and they don't really connect to the otherwise bumpy shapes that I did for it. It was a fun way to do the line art this time, and everything about the cloak sort of came together to convey the impression of moss that I wanted to achieve. Before we cover the other details and choices though, I want to address the colour palette here briefly. So, I always knew that there was going to be a lot of green in it. Bright green, light green, dark green and middle tones of green. I knew it would be the primary colour of everything within this piece, as it was the typical colour that is tied to moss and would sort of need to be used to actually make her look like she is a character of moss. From there, however, I did want to find ways to maybe break it up that little bit, so it wasn't entirely one colour, as it was a little bit too much for me. To work out the colours that I would pair it with, I kind of looked at the objects often around my idea of moss. When I think of it, forests then commonly come to mind, and these were the objects that were being introduced to the cloak and on the belt. Things like stones and so on. So it meant that I could introduce the grey from the stones, but I didn't want to really rely on it. I really only needed colours for the hair and skin tone at this point too, and using grey wasn't really something I considered for it. I mean, I wanted them to look alive, as that ties in well with moss. With the inky cap, I could get away with it and using that greyer tone on the skin, as it matched the palette. The process for the appearance sort of means that it was an option. But with moss, it's much more lively to me when I think about it. It's able to grow in so many situations that grey would counter that aspect of it. So really it's why I chose to give them a natural skin tone, since it was also something I knew I would end up doing with the next character too. In a way, if I'd gone with green, it would have just been way too much, and I likely would have started to dislike how this character was going. But also making this choice here meant that only the inky cap has a skin tone taken from their plant palette. And that's only because it worked. But with this one, with everything worked out, I kind of finished the colour palette from then on and it just came together so much easier and I ended up starting to love the way it was looking. But for now we can turn back to the details just for the end of this character here. So the next big detail up is the dress. I wanted it layered and I wanted it long. A lot of the details for moss had been looking at how it can cover and exist within environments. Quite a handful of my references looked at moss in a covering and blanketed sense. And that word blanketed is something that I have been commonly using in this section to describe it, as it is kind of one of the main motifs I'd been working from. Yet it all means that I didn't want to keep the skirt short or a single layer. The layered skirt kind of came from how the moss looks up close. There's parts packed close together, so they do kind of end up covering each other for that layered appearance, which I wanted to mimic in the skirt, whilst also not making the skirt too busy that it would take away from the cloak. It's mainly the only reason I didn't make the skirt out of moss as well, though I did consider it briefly. It just ended up far too busy, if you ask me. It also worked well with the cloak to have the skirt quite simple, and I quite liked the route that it was taking. It was actually coming together quite well to convey the appearance and the personality that I wanted at the same time. As I've already said, moss to me would be soft, and it's found in many places. So in terms of personality, I wanted to go with something more fun and smiling. Maybe make it look like she's more welcoming and cheerful than anything due to the aspect of moss itself. Now the final detail to really touch on here briefly is the little pom-poms around. That's really the best way that I could actually describe them or mention them at the moment, but they're the pale green things around the hem of the skirt tier and the one in her hand. These were meant to be like little balls of moss, if anything. They're meant to resemble the texture in the rest of the piece, as I did lean heavily into this throughout different aspects of it. But it really worked well to add that extra level of details to the character, without, again, overpowering anything. And it's also so that it didn't end up too plain compared to the inky cap and the next character in the lineup. Besides, these little pom-pom shapes really let me have fun with it, and add those little bits of detail that wouldn't take me forever to detail or shade or fix after the fact. Though I will admit, I did forget to colour some on the skirt hem until I actually came to shade them, so I did fix that in the end though. All in all, I did really enjoy working with the ideas of moss. It worked a lot better since I didn't really narrow it down to a single species of moss in the end, and I knew that I wouldn't want to. I wasn't too focused on properly conveying the narrower avenue of a moss's location, or the properties of it, and I could instead use a range of references, with again not worrying that one was accidentally a different kind of moss that just looked similar, but was entirely different besides that. Plus, at the end of it all, I could have fun coming up with things like the cloak, and trying to work out what would work well for this character, and what ideas would be best set aside for another one that would end up similar if I ever decided to revisit it. If anything, I would maybe change the face in newer versions, and that's only really because I've been staring at it too much, and the longer that I look at it, the less it reads how it's meant to be. But even in saying that, it still has the cheerful element of the smile that I wanted. Besides, I actually quite enjoy the background that I ended up with this one. I mean, I know that that wasn't a priority this time, and that was on purpose, since it would have taken me far longer to do a background for each character, and the character themselves. So I did keep it to the simple squares of colour and a plain background, with the little bit at the bottom that they were standing on and their relative plant around them. But for moss, I had fun adding the little bits to the top, and kind of just including it that way, as it didn't distract from anything. And it also kind of furthered the idea of moss being around her and that she was moss once more. Again though, with her, I also wasn't sure on the background colour for quite some time, and it is probably the one that I changed the most compared to any other. But again, I eventually worked out, and I still do quite like the outcome, all of that being said. However, yet again, we are brought to the end of moss here at this point, so let's start turning our attention towards the next, and final, plant that we will be looking at for this video, shall we? So, flowers are a thing that come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, and I mean there's like a lot of them. This is another group I could quite easily start an entire series on, where I take flowers and turn them into people and so on, and that is something that I will consider if people are interested in that idea. However, for the sake of today, I had to sort of just pick one and go with it, as flowers in general are a little bit too broad and just too much for me to work with for a single character right now. It kind of is similar to the mushroom situation. And to be honest, I quite enjoy the look of roses and the appearance or meanings that they could carry. So it kind of felt like a good place to begin with it all, and that is what we're looking at. Yet, when making a character, roses also come in many, many colours, and I felt it easier just to look at one so I wasn't juggling a whole load of different meanings that may have otherwise conflicted one another. So, red roses it was. It's the most thought of rose and one that was quite straightforward, as people are familiar with the meanings it can take. A red rose ties to love, and people know this more than what a yellow or a white rose might mean. It is also the most recognisable visually to work with, especially compared to the others, since I knew that I'd be using the petals of the flower quite a bit on their own, and a lot of other flowers also come in yellow or white that they may be confused with. The second rose that I did consider maybe working with was the pink rose. But again, that was quite similar to a red, so I just kind of allowed myself to go with my first thought and to explore it that bit further. So in terms of early ideas, I did end up with quite a few. The most prominent was turning the rose petals, the way they overlap and interact, into the skirt for the dress. It was really the only thing I actually knew that I wanted to include for it, and everything else got built up around this element. The petals made a nice, shorter dress that also broke this character up from the other two that little bit, where the other two had looked at quite long dresses and those designs, yet this one just fit the rose that bit better and gave him that sense of individuality in the lineup. It was simple compared to the other two, yes. There wasn't really any other details I could add or that I wanted to add, as it just kind of worked on its own. But that again is part of the character and part of why I like how they ended up. From there as well, however, I wanted to use the other parts of the flowers too in their design. The thorns and the leaves are the main example for this, since doing this would also break up part of the palette that little bit, just so that I wouldn't run into the same situation that I had for moss, where it was all very monochrome and one colour. I mean, I had also used the flower in a few other sections as well, such as the necklace and the bracelet, where the rose is a bit more obvious and put together. They're also present in the hairpiece to kind of finalise that area as well, and just to sort of push this idea that the figure is a bit more dressed up. And that I will touch on and expand on a bit more in a moment here. Before we touch on it, the leaves became the top part of the dress quite easily. It was mainly that it was the part of the flower that I had left to work with, but it also made the most sense for this purpose, and I just thought that it would look better out of everything else that I had to work with. I mean, using the thorns would mean layering them and overlapping quite a lot of them, and that kind of risked as not so much reading as thorns in the first place. The petals had been on the skirt, and yes, I could have easily used them as the top part as well. The overlapping would have looked quite nice and would have been quite a similar motif as to what I ended up with. But it just kind of ended up as a little bit too much for the dress and the design overall, and it did risk it being that, again, just a bit too much. So the leaves balanced it out. And that one kind of worked itself out in the end. The thorns in the end then got added to the hairpiece. A few of them were used to accent the band and the roses there, which, when looking closer, looks a lot better than if I had used it anywhere else, especially if I'd used it to make up the top part of the dress. Because as well, if I'd used it to make up the top part of the dress, then it could have made the character quite spiky and unapproachable, which wasn't something that I was really going for with the rose. I wanted the thorns to be subtle, as that is a lot more common in the imagery of a rose than anything else. Now, the final detail to really touch on with them here is the tattoos that I ended up giving them. I mean, it's very rare that I actually remember that I can give characters tattoos, and I was, again, in two minds about it even here. See, I wanted her to read as if she's dressed up for a certain occasion, something a bit more formal than people would wear every day, as roses are usually meant for special occasions or tied to themes of elegance and decoration and so on. Some people would argue that tattoos do counter this impression, And there is a lot that I could say about how tattoos are seen or how people think about them, as there are many, many different opinions and thoughts on them. Yet I kind of decided that I could still include them since tattoos by many are also seen as something of importance or holding meaning. People can get them because they like it, or because they want something to document an experience, an occasion, memories or people and so on. Others also hold historical meanings, so there's kind of a lot more in that side of the opinion than anything that would force me to disinclude it from this character. I also came to feel that the tattoo was a nice detail for the arms where I added them. One of them is a branch of leaves and a vine, and I kind of got this idea because I know at least 2 people in real life who have this, and it kind of made sense for a character based on a flower to have it. It was a nice subtle touch at the very least. It was a subtle nod to include the leaves in a smaller way as well as the top part of the dress, and again it balanced out this inclusion. The other one I gave them was the first one that I wanted to give them. It's meant to be a web of lines that could be connected to a root system, since it was the only part of the plant that I hadn't yet included, and I didn't really see a way that it would be included or majorly referenced in the rest of the character at this point. At least not without distracting from other points at the very least. The detail then looked nice, so it ended up staying, since I knew I would like it better this way. They didn't distract from anything, and the attention is still on the parts of the person where they're meant to be, like the dress and how they're stood and so on. At the end of the figure, I do think it worked out quite well. She was a fun way to wrap up this set of 3 for today, and also fairly simple when compared to the other 2. I did worry for a short while that she may have been a bit too plain besides the others, yet when I put them all together I realised that it worked with the simplicity, and she stood out because of that. She didn't need to be overly decorated, as doing so would have taken away from her design, and also taken away from what I'd hoped to achieve with it. And they did end up working standing next to one another too. Otherwise, the only thing that I didn't really know about until the end, besides all of that, had been the background colour. It's been a thing that I wasn't sure about for many of them, since they all had a primary colour from their palette and their plant, yet I didn't want to continue that into the background too, where it would have flattened the entire image and risked losing that character against it. If I'd gone with green in Moss's image, for example, the character would be lost in the background, or if I'd gone with white, black or grey for the Inky Cat mushroom, it would have flattened the image and there would be nothing to really make the character stand out against it. With the rose, if I'd gone with red, it would have been the very same issue. So in the end here, I did decide to go with the green that matches the leaves. And I think it did look alright in the end when I decided to keep it, because it ties into the colours but very subtly, and it again doesn't flatten the image. However, that is all that I have to say for this set today. So until we run out of time, I do just want to mention something really quickly here, and that is if you enjoy this sort of video where I turn things into people and design characters based off things within the world, do just let me know and I will happily continue to do more of this. I have ideas for moths, for flowers, mushrooms, and other objects in the world. I also feel that I would enjoy looking towards space with further ideas, to look at planets and stars, or even the moon if people would want to see that coming up in the future too. I do just want to experiment with different formats here, so that's all I've really been doing as of late, and kind of what I've been exploring in the background here. Now with all of that said, we have actually come up to the end of today's video. Normally I would cut to the final outcome with all 3 of them together, but I felt that I could maybe show something a little bit different than what I would usually do here at the end, and it won't really take too long here either. This section here at the end is something that I've kind of added to just show a bit more of the creation process that may be missed within the video, with it moving all a bit too quick. See, when working with characters, I usually have a set of slides that kind of expand on the aims of them, and kind of look at their ideas and what I want to do with them. It's mainly more to help me keep it all in one place and to just kind of keep track of what I'm working with, but it does really help to have it all in one place. So this time I've decided that I'm sharing them. I do go through more that isn't on the slides as well, Things like early research into the objects and the science behind processes they use. Yet this is a summary of things that I feel may be useful for later in the art process, where they sit amongst the references for when I'm drawing. Then I enjoy documenting the entire process that I really take. It's here that I document the sketches, and kind of what I take from them, including the final one, and all the different stages that come before the outcome. There's the lines here, the flat colours, all part of the processes that are needed for that outcome to be as good as I can get it. I don't know if it interests people or not, but it felt that it was fun to show anyway. But for now, however, that is the end of this video, and I do hope that you all have enjoyed it. I will see you in the next one, but for now, this is goodbye.